I watched Sarah's face light up as we pulled into the small gravel parking area at the edge of Allegheny National Forest. After 4 hours of driving from Pittsburgh, with our dog Andy whining anxiously in the back seat for the last 30 minutes, we'd finally arrived. The moment I cut the engine, Andy started pawing at the window. "Someone's excited," I said, unlocking the doors. Sarah opened the back door, and Andy bolted out, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed at the dirt and pine needles. We'd been planning this trip for months. 3 days of complete isolation, no cell service, no emails, no emergency calls from the hospital for Sarah or last-minute client revisions for me. "Let's get moving before it gets too late," Sarah said, already pulling her backpack from the trunk. I grabbed Andy's leash and our tent while Sarah organized the food supplies. The late afternoon sun came through the trees, making spots of light on the ground. The air smelled good, like pine and dirt that reminded me how much I'd missed being outdoors. I'd been stuck looking at computer screens too long. I checked the trail map again, I said, slinging my pack over my shoulders. "The path gets pretty faint about a mile in, but it should lead us to a good clearing." Sarah nodded, cinching her pack tight. "Lead the way, wilderness man." With Andy tugging eagerly at his leash, we hit the narrow trail that whined into the trees. The path was well marked at first, with occasional wooden posts, but gradually became less distinct as we pushed deeper into the forest. 2 miles in, the trail was barely more than a suggestion between the trees. "You sure we're not lost?" Sarah asked, pushing a branch away from her face. "Trust me," I said, even as I double-checked the small compass I'd brought. The clearing should be just ahead. 5 minutes later, the trees opened up to reveal exactly what I'd been hoping for. A wide, flat area bordered by tall pines, with enough space for our tent and a fire pit. Previous hikers had arranged stones in a circle near the center. "Perfect," Sarah breathed, dropping her pack and rolling her shoulders. Andy circled the clearing, nose to the ground, investigating every inch of our new temporary home. "I told you this would be worth it," I said, setting down our gear. Complete isolation. We fell into our usual camping rhythm. I handled the tent while Sarah organized our supplies. The 4-person tent was overkill for 2 people and a dog, but we liked the extra space. I drove the stakes firmly into the ground, remembering the time we'd camped in Michigan and a midnight rainstorm had nearly collapsed our poorly secured shelter. "Stove's ready," Sarah called as I finished with the tent. She had our compact camping stove set up on a flat rock, already heating water for tea. By the time we had the sleeping bags arranged inside the tent and firewood collected, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. I got a fire going in the stone circle while Sarah pulled out our camp chairs. "This is perfect," Sarah said, settling into her chair as the flames grew stronger. I needed this so badly. The past month at the hospital had been brutal for her. Understaffed shifts and a wave of particularly sick kids had left her emotionally drained. My own job had been a nightmare of impossible deadlines and a demanding client who couldn't make up his mind about what he wanted. Andy flopped down between our chairs, his eyes half closed but ears still alert, occasionally lifting his head at distant rustles and calls from the forest. "Hungry?" I asked, reaching for the cooler. "Starving," Sarah replied. I laid out metal skewers and a package of sausages while Sarah opened a bottle of wine. The simple act of cooking over an open fire felt like a return to something essential that had been missing from our apartment in the city. "To disconnecting," Sarah said, raising her plastic cup of wine. "To remembering what matters," I replied, touching my cup to hers. The sausages sizzled over the flames, fat dripping and causing occasional flare-ups. Andy's eyes followed every movement of the food, his nose twitching hopefully. "Don't even think about it," I told him, though I knew we'd both end up slipping him pieces when we thought the other wasn't looking. We ate as darkness settled fully around us, the fire casting our small circle in warm light while the forest beyond faded to black. After dinner, Sarah pulled out marshmallows, and we roasted them to golden perfection. "Look up," I said, pointing through a gap in the trees above us. The night sky was alive with stars, thousands more than we could ever see in Pittsburgh. The longer we looked, the more appeared, as if the darkness was gradually revealing its secrets. "That's Cassiopeia," I said, pointing to a distinctive W-shaped pattern, "and over there is the Big Dipper." "Show off," Sarah said, but she squeezed my hand as she said it. "We really should do this more often," she added after a moment. "I forgot how quiet it is out here." The forest wasn't actually quiet. It was filled with sounds, but they were natural ones. Wind rustling through pine needles, an owl hooting somewhere in the distance, the occasional snap of our fire. What was missing was the constant background noise of the city: traffic, sirens, neighbors, air conditioners, the noise of electronics. "We could make it a monthly thing," I suggested. "Different parks each time." "I'd like that," Sarah said, leaning her head on my shoulder. We sat like that for nearly an hour, talking about places we wanted to visit, small things that had happened at work, plans for the rest of the year, all the conversations we were usually too tired or busy to have. As midnight approached, the fire burned down to glowing embers. Andy had been asleep for a while, but his ears still twitched occasionally in response to forest sounds. "Ready for bed?" I asked, noticing Sarah trying to hide a yawn. She nodded, and we carefully put out the fire, making sure every ember was out before heading to the tent. Andy followed us inside, circling 3 times before settling at the foot of our sleeping bags. The inside of the tent was cozy, our sleeping bags zipped together to make one large one. Sarah curled against me, her breathing quickly becoming slow and steady. Through the mesh window of the tent, I could see patches of the star-filled sky between the tree branches. I listened to the gentle sounds around us, the soft whisper of wind through the pines, Sarah's rhythmic breathing, Andy's occasional sighs. The ground was hard under our sleeping pads, but I still felt more comfortable than I had in weeks. My shoulders and neck finally started to relax. As I started falling asleep, I tried to remember this peaceful feeling for when I'd be back at my stressful job. The last thing I thought about was how thankful I was to be here, far away from all the demands and deadlines. I fell asleep listening to all the night sounds of the forest, not knowing that something unwelcome would soon break the quiet. I woke up suddenly at 3 a.m. in our dark tent. Something felt wrong. Not just the usual discomfort of sleeping on the ground or the weird forest sounds. Something else I couldn't quite figure out. I lay still for a moment, trying to understand what had woken me up. Sarah breathed steadily beside me, one arm thrown across her face. Then I noticed it. I could hear wind moving through the pine trees above us, that whisper and creak of branches moving. But the walls of our tent were completely still. The fabric wasn't moving at all. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Sarah. The nylon walls of the tent should have been moving, at least a little, with any breeze strong enough to make the tall pines move. I reached for my flashlight, finding it next to my pillow where I'd left it. With one last look at Sarah sleeping, I unzipped the tent door as quietly as possible and slipped outside. The night air was strange. I could hear the wind in the trees above, but the air around me was completely still. I looked up to check what I was hearing. Yes, the upper branches of the pines were definitely moving against the night sky, but down here, at ground level, there wasn't even the slightest breeze on my skin. Our campfire had gone out completely, without even the smallest glow in the ashes. I moved my flashlight across our small clearing. Everything looked normal. Our camp chairs, the firewood stack, our cooler. A soft whine came from the tent, and Andy pushed his nose through the partly open door. He squeezed out to join me, but something was off about him. Instead of his usual relaxed pose, the hair on his back was standing up, his tail low and stiff. He looked hard into the darkness beyond our camp, ears pointed forward. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following his gaze with my flashlight beam. The light caught only trees and underbrush, nothing unusual. Then I heard it. Click, click, click. The sound came from somewhere in the trees. A hollow, clicking noise, like someone tapping a stick against wood, but with a weird, empty quality that didn't sound like anything from the woods I knew. Click, click, pause. Click, click, click. Andy pressed against my leg, a low growl building in his throat. I stood completely still, trying to follow the sound with my ears. It moved, changing position through the trees beyond our clearing, circling our campsite at a distance. The rhythm was irregular, starting and stopping without any pattern I could figure out. "Hello?" I called, not too loudly. I didn't want to wake Sarah if this turned out to be nothing. "Someone there." The clicking stopped immediately. I waited, my flashlight shining in the dark, pointing toward where I'd last heard the sound. Nothing moved. No sound came. The forest had gone completely quiet. No insects chirping or night animals moving around. "Hello?" I tried again, taking a few steps toward the tree line. Andy didn't follow. Instead, he backed up toward the tent entrance, his growl turning into a worried whine. I stopped, feeling really nervous all of a sudden. I had no weapon except my pocket knife, and something about how Andy was acting gave me the creeps. Just as I decided to go back to the tent, the clicking started again, from a completely different direction than before. Click, 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 click. I turned around fast, pointing my flashlight toward the new noise. Again, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. I went back to the tent, and Andy quickly ducked inside. I followed, zipping the door closed behind us. Sarah was still sound asleep. I sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag, listening. The clicking continued outside, moving around our campsite in a wide circle. Sometimes it seemed to come from different places at once, though that might have been echoes bouncing around in the dark. For 2 hours I stayed awake, trying to follow the sounds as they moved through the woods around us. Andy stayed alert next to me, sometimes growling softly when the clicking came from a new spot. Around 5 a.m., as the sky started getting lighter in the east, the clicking began to fade. The time between sounds got longer. The clicks sounded farther away until they stopped completely. Only then did I notice the tent fabric moving slightly as a breeze finally touched our campsite. Whatever weird stillness had been around us was gone. I must have fallen asleep eventually. The next thing I knew, sunlight was coming through the tent mesh and Sarah was waking up next to me. "Morning," she murmured, stretching her arms above her head. "How'd you sleep?" "Not great," I admitted, rubbing my eyes. "I woke up around 3 and couldn't get back to sleep." Sarah sat up, pushing hair from her face. "Why? What happened?" I told her about how weirdly still everything was, the way the trees moved even though there was no breeze down where we were, and the strange clicking sounds that went around our camp for hours. As I spoke, Sarah's expression changed from concern to mild amusement. "Sounds like you had quite the vivid dream," she said, patting my arm. "Or maybe you heard a woodpecker or some other animal." "It wasn't a dream," I insisted. "And it definitely wasn't a woodpecker. Andy heard it too. He was growling and everything." Sarah glanced at Andy, who had finally relaxed enough to curl up at our feet. "Well, he seems fine now." She unzipped the tent door. "I'm going to grab the water for coffee." I watched her step outside, casual and unconcerned. Maybe she was right. Maybe my stressed-out brain had conjured strange meanings from normal forest sounds. Maybe the stillness had been some weird weather phenomenon. But as we prepared breakfast outside, I noticed Andy wouldn't roam freely as he had yesterday. He stayed close to our legs, his eyes repeatedly returning to the tree line with unusual intensity. I found myself doing the same, looking at the forest edge as I flipped pancakes on our small camp stove. "These look amazing," Sarah said, holding out her plate. I slid a pancake onto it, forcing a smile. "Nothing like breakfast outdoors, right?" She nodded, already taking a bite. I kept cooking, trying to push away the nervousness. It was a beautiful morning. Birds singing, sunlight streaming through the trees, the air fresh and cool. But I couldn't shake the memory of those clicks in the darkness, or the way they'd stopped whenever I approached, as if whatever made them was watching me, responding to my movements. I served myself the last pancake and sat beside Sarah, keeping Andy between us. "So, what's the plan for today?" Sarah asked, finishing her breakfast. "I thought we could hike to that lake I read about. It's supposed to be about an hour from here." "Sounds perfect." I nodded and sipped my coffee, not mentioning that I'd be bringing my hunting knife on the hike, or that I'd be watching Andy more carefully than we discussed. If Sarah thought I was being paranoid, so be it. Better paranoid than unprepared if those clicking sounds came back. I tried to focus on the trail ahead as we hiked toward the lake, but I kept thinking about those clicking sounds from the night before. Sarah walked slightly ahead, pointing out interesting plants and the occasional bird without a care in the world. Andy, normally eager to dash ahead and explore, stayed unusually close to my legs, occasionally looking back toward our campsite with suspicious looks. "This is the perfect day for swimming," Sarah said, wiping sweat from her forehead as we crested a small hill. The morning had warmed quickly, the sun bright overhead through gaps in the tree canopy. "I bet the water will feel amazing." "Yeah," I agreed, trying to match her enthusiasm while my hand kept brushing the hunting knife I'd slipped into my pocket before we left. I hadn't told Sarah I was carrying it. The trail narrowed as we went down toward the lake, forcing us to walk single file. Andy stuck close behind me, watching carefully instead of sniffing around like he usually did. After about an hour of hiking, the trees opened up to show the lake, a surprisingly big, clear lake sitting in a small valley, with rocks along our shore and thick forest coming right up to the water on the other side. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, already unlacing her hiking boots. "Come on, last one in is cooking dinner tonight." I smiled as she took off her clothes to show the swimsuit she had on underneath. The lake looked nice, and swimming on a hot day seemed like just what we needed. I changed quickly and went into the water with her. The cold water shocked me and made me forget my worries for a bit. Andy walked back and forth along the edge of the lake. He normally loves water but wouldn't come in with us. He sat at the edge with his ears up, his eyes looking at the trees behind us. "What's up with him today?" Sarah asked, floating on her back near me. "He's being so clingy." I shrugged, not wanting to admit that his behavior only reinforced my concerns. Maybe he's just tired from yesterday's hike. We swam for nearly an hour, the cool water refreshing after the hot hike. Sarah seemed completely at ease, laughing and splashing like we were on any normal camping trip. I tried to join in, to feel as relaxed as we were when we first arrived, but part of me stayed on high alert, constantly looking around at the shores and the forest beyond. After swimming, we dried off on a large, flat rock that jutted out over the water. Sarah unpacked the lunch we'd brought, simple sandwiches and fruit, while I kept watch, trying not to be obvious about it. "This is exactly what I needed," Sarah said, leaning back on her elbows, face tilted toward the sun. "No hospital, no emergencies, just this." I nodded, taking a bite of my sandwich. I couldn't really eat because I was too anxious. Andy sat between us, accepting small pieces of turkey I slipped him, but even though he looked relaxed, his ears perked up now and then when he heard sounds in the distance. "What time is it?" I asked, suddenly aware of the sun's position. Sarah checked her watch. "Almost 2. Why?" "Just thinking about heading back soon." I tried to sound casual. It'll take an hour to get to camp, and I want to have time to get dinner going before dark. We got plenty of time, Sarah said, but she started packing up our things anyway. The days are long this time of year. As we got ready to leave, I started thinking about how long it would take us to pack up our entire campsite if we needed to make a quick exit. The thought of spending another night in that tent, with those clicking sounds circling us in the darkness, made my stomach clench. The hike back seemed quicker. Our muscles warmed up from the morning trek and swimming. As our campsite came into view, I slowed my pace, looking around for anything out of place. Everything looked normal. Our tent stood undisturbed, the camp chairs positioned where we'd left them, the blackened remains of last night's fire in the stone circle. Andy hesitated at the edge of the clearing, requiring a gentle tug on his leash to follow us in. "You know," I said, setting down my backpack, "I was thinking, maybe we should pack up and drive to a hotel tonight." Sarah turned to me, surprise clear on her face. "A hotel? Why would we do that after we hiked all the way out here?" "The tent was really warm last night," I offered lamely. "I barely slept. Might be nice to have air conditioning, a real shower." "Since when do you bail on camping because it's a little warm?" Sarah laughed, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "We've been planning this trip for months. What's really going on?" I considered telling her everything, how the clicking sounds had circled our camp for hours, how weird the quiet had felt, how something just felt off about these woods. But the skepticism in her eyes stopped me. She already thought I was being paranoid about normal forest sounds. "Nothing," I said finally. "You're right, just a passing thought." Sarah studied me for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Let's get dinner started. I'm starving after all that swimming." As the sun started to go down, I built a new fire while Sarah prepared a foil packet of vegetables and pre-seasoned chicken to cook over the flames. I found myself constantly looking up, checking the tree line, listening for anything unusual over the normal sounds of the forest. "You're jumpy today," Sarah observed as she handed me a cup of wine. "Still thinking about those clicking sounds?" "Just being cautious," I replied, taking a sip. The wine did nothing to calm my nerves. Dinner was really good, great chicken and tasty vegetables, but I barely noticed what I was eating. When it got dark, I felt more and more worried. I added more wood to the fire, making it bigger than we needed, telling myself the extra light would help keep away whatever had made those sounds. Sarah yawned around 9. "Ready for bed?" I nodded, too scared to speak. Inside the tent, I put my knife close by while Sarah changed into pajamas and slipped into our shared sleeping bag. Andy lay at our feet, looking stiff and tired. "Night," Sarah murmured, kissing my cheek before settling in. "Night," I whispered back, knowing sleep would be impossible for me. I lay there, listening to Sarah's breathing get deeper as she fell asleep. The forest outside seemed normal at first. Crickets chirping, the occasional noise of night animals moving through the bushes. I looked at my watch. 11:23 p.m. I must have fallen asleep even though I wanted to stay awake, because I suddenly woke up when everything got quiet. The crickets had stopped. The night birds were silent. I checked my watch again, 1:58 a.m. Then it started. Click, click, click. The same hollow, empty sound from the night before, but closer now. Much closer. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Sarah. Andy was already awake, his eyes catching the faint moonlight coming through the tent mesh. Click, click, click. Pause. Click. Unlike last night, the sounds came from multiple directions at once, not repeating sounds. Different sources, as if several things were surrounding our camp, talking to each other through those weird clicks. I grabbed my knife and tried to figure out where the sounds were coming from. They were moving, circling our tent just as they had circled the wider campsite the night before, but in a much tighter pattern now. Andy pressed against my side, a low growl building in his throat. Click, 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 click. The pattern seemed more complex tonight, almost rhythmic in a way I couldn't quite understand. The clicking would speed up, then slow down, sometimes overlapping from different directions like a conversation. Sarah moved beside me but didn't wake up. I put my hand on Andy's muzzle to quiet his growl, afraid the sound might draw attention. Or worse, wake Sarah and cause her to make a noise. For nearly an hour, I sat still, listening to the clicks move around us. Sometimes they would stop all at once, leaving a strange quiet. Each time I held my breath, sure that something was about to touch the tent, to try to get in. Then the clicking would start again and the weird game would continue. At 3:22 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. I carefully unzipped the tent door, just enough to look out. The clicking stopped instantly. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, moving it across the clearing and into the trees beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing showed up in the light. After a full minute of silence, I zipped the tent closed again. The moment the zipper stopped, the clicking started again, louder now and from spots much closer to the tent. Something had used my distraction to move in. I felt really scared. Andy was completely on guard, his eyes fixed on the tent entrance, teeth occasionally showing in a silent snarl. Click, 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 click. The sounds kept going in their strange pattern, sometimes getting quieter like they were moving away, only to return even closer than before. By 4 a.m., they were so close that I swear I could feel vibrations through the ground beneath our sleeping pad. I held my knife, sure that at any moment something would press against the tent, would try to open it from outside, but nothing touched the tent. The clicking continued its odd rhythm until the first hints of dawn brightened the sky visible through the mesh. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. First a distant bird call, then the noise of small animals in the bushes, finally the full chorus of morning wildlife. I hadn't slept at all. My eyes hurt and my muscles were sore from being tense for hours. Andy finally relaxed enough to lay his head down, though he stayed pressed against my side. When Sarah woke around 7 a.m., she found me sitting up, knife still in hand, staring at the tent door. Mike. She touched my arm, concern immediate in her voice. Did you sleep at all? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak without my voice cracking. What happened? She sat up, fully awake now. You look terrible. It came back, I said hoarsely. The clicking, all night, surrounding the tent. Sarah's concern deepened as she took in my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the pallor of my skin, the white-knuckled grip I maintained on the knife. Maybe we should go home today, she suggested carefully. You're clearly not getting any rest out here. I nodded, feeling better at her suggestion. Something's out there, Sarah. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural. She bit her lip, looking at my face. I could tell she still didn't really believe me, but seeing how worried I was made her less doubtful. You heard it too, right? She asked, turning to Andy, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. Or was it just Mike? Andy's ear twitched at his name, but he didn't wake. I know what I heard, I said firmly. And it wasn't a dream or an animal or the wind. Something is out there, and it's been watching us since we arrived. Sarah squeezed my hand. Let's have breakfast and we can talk about what to do. You need food and coffee after being up all night. I nodded, letting her take the knife. She unzipped the tent and stepped outside into the morning sunlight. I followed, looking around the tree line in the harsh daylight, checking for any sign of what had surrounded us in the darkness. The forest looked completely normal, peaceful even, as if mocking my fear. Birds sang in the branches, squirrels chased each other up tree trunks, and a gentle breeze stirred the pine needles. Nothing remained of the night's terror except my exhaustion and the memory of those hollow, empty clicks. The sunlight felt harsh on my face as we finished our breakfast. I hadn't slept a minute last night, and my body felt it. Every muscle ached from the hours spent rigid with tension, listening to those clicking sounds circle our tent. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus on the campsite around us. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Our 2 camp chairs, which had definitely been facing the tent last night when we went to bed, now pointed toward the dense forest on the opposite side of our clearing. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. We hadn't moved them this morning. We'd come straight from the tent to the fire pit to make breakfast. "Sarah," I called, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Did you move the chairs?" She looked up from packing away the breakfast supplies. "What?" "The chairs," I pointed. "Did you turn them around?" Sarah walked over to stand beside me, following my gaze. "No. Why would I do that?" "Someone did," I said. "They were facing the tent last night." I walked toward the chairs slowly, looking at the ground around them for footprints or any sign of who or what might have moved them during the night. The dirt showed nothing, just the same scattered pine needles and twigs that covered the rest of our campsite. I called Andy over, but instead of coming, he backed away, tail tucked between his legs. His reaction made me feel really nervous. "It was probably just the wind," Sarah said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The chairs were visibly rattling her too, though she was trying to hide it. "These chairs weigh at least 10 pounds each," I countered, "and they were turned completely around. That would take a strong, deliberate push, not a random gust." Sarah crossed her arms, looking uncomfortable. "Well, what's your explanation then?" Before I could answer, Andy started barking sharply and lunged toward the tree line with his teeth bared. Sarah and I both spun around, looking at the forest edge. "What is it, boy?" I asked, stepping closer to him. Andy kept barking, looking at something in the trees that Sarah and I couldn't see. The thick pines didn't show anything strange, just dark spaces between the tree trunks and some birds flying around, spooked by Andy's barking. After a minute of this, Andy got quiet, but he was still on edge, staring at that same spot in the forest. "I've had enough," I said, making a sudden decision. "I'm going to set up my GoPro." "Your GoPro?" Sarah asked. "What for?" "To see what's visiting our camp when we're not looking." I went to my backpack and dug through it until I found the small camera I'd packed for scenic shots. "I'll set it up before we leave for our hike." "So we're still going hiking?" Sarah asked, sounding surprised. "Yeah," I said, checking the camera's battery. It was nearly full. "I think we should stick to our plan. Go to Rimrock Overlook like we talked about. But I want this recording while we're gone." I found a good spot on a tree trunk at the edge of our clearing, positioning the camera at eye level with a clear view of our entire campsite. I made sure it was secure, then started the recording. "There," I said, stepping back to ensure it was hidden enough not to be immediately obvious, but still had a clear view. 8 hours of battery life should cover our hike and then some. Sarah watched me with a mixture of concern and confusion. "You really think something's going to show up on that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I need to know what's happening here, don't you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I guess I do. It's just..." She looked around the campsite, her eyes lingering on the chairs that now faced the forest. "This doesn't make any sense." "No, it doesn't," I agreed. "That's why we need to find out what's going on." We gathered our day packs for the hike to Rimrock Overlook. I made sure to bring plenty of water, some trail mix, and sandwiches for lunch. I also slipped my hunting knife into my pocket again. Andy seemed relieved to leave the campsite, pulling ahead on his leash as we headed down the trail. The path to Rimrock was better maintained than the one we'd taken to the lake yesterday, with clear markers and even wooden steps in the steeper sections. As we hiked, Sarah tried to make sense of everything that had happened. "Maybe it's some local kids playing pranks," she suggested as we climbed a particularly steep section. "They could have found our campsite and decided to mess with us." "In the middle of the night?" I asked. "Miles from any road? And what about those clicking sounds? That's not exactly a standard teenage prank." "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but it makes more sense than whatever you're thinking." "What am I thinking?" I challenged. She shrugged. "Something not natural. Something, I don't know, not human." I didn't respond. She'd hit too close to my own fears, and I didn't want to make them more real by saying them out loud. The Rimrock overlook was really amazing. On a normal day, I would have loved the scenery, maybe taking tons of photos. Today, I just felt like we needed to get back to camp as soon as possible. We ate our lunch on the rocks, the sun warm overhead. Andy stayed close, not going off to explore like he usually would. Sarah seemed to relax a bit, the pretty view taking her mind off the weird stuff back at camp. "This is amazing," she said, gazing out at the view. "I'm glad we came." I nodded, trying to enjoy the moment. "It is beautiful." "Listen," Sarah began, turning to me, "about what's been happening. I know something strange is going on. I don't think you're making it up or imagining things. Not anymore. Not after seeing those chairs." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. "That means a lot." We stayed at the overlook for about an hour before starting the hike back. The return journey felt faster, both of us moving with purpose rather than taking time to enjoy the scenery. We arrived back at our campsite around 3 p.m., having been gone for about 4 hours. The first thing I did was check the GoPro. I removed it from the tree and turned it off, then pulled out my phone so we could review the footage right away. "Anything weird happen while we were gone?" Sarah asked, looking around the campsite. Everything appeared untouched from when we'd left. I connected the memory card to my phone and opened the files. My stomach dropped. "The files are corrupted." "What do you mean?" Sarah looked over my shoulder at the screen. "All of them." I scrolled through the list of video files, each one showing an error when I tried to open it. 8 hours of footage, all unviewable. Sarah frowned. "Maybe the card is bad? Or the camera malfunctioned?" "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. The GoPro was nearly new, and I'd used this memory card successfully just last month. Then I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. I walked back to the tree where I'd mounted the camera and compared its current position to my memory of where I'd placed it. "It moved," I said quietly. "What?" Sarah came to stand beside me. "The camera. I mounted it pointing directly at our tent in the fire pit. Now it's angled about 20 degrees to the left." I demonstrated with my hands. "Someone or something turned it while we were gone." Sarah looked at the tree, then at me, her face pale. "Are you sure? Maybe you're remembering wrong. We were in a hurry this morning." "I'm not remembering wrong," I insisted. I lined it up carefully. "Someone moved it, Sarah. The same someone who turned our chairs around last night." We stood in silence for a moment, the implications settling over us like a dark cloud. Andy pressed against my legs, seemingly as uncomfortable as we were. "What do we do?" Sarah finally asked, her voice small. "We keep the camera with us tonight," I decided. "Inside the tent. If something comes around again, we'll capture it." Sarah nodded, no longer arguing or trying to explain things logically. The moved camera had finally convinced her that something really weird was happening. We stayed in camp for the rest of the afternoon, not wanting to go far. I made the fire earlier than needed, wanting the comfort of its light and heat. Sarah sat close to me, sometimes looking at the woods with worried eyes. As it got dark, we cooked a simple dinner of pasta with jarred sauce, eating quickly and barely talking. The forest around us seemed to get scarier as time passed. "I'm scared, Mike," Sarah admitted as we cleaned up after dinner. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and hearing those words from her, practical, rational Sarah, sent a chill through me. "Me too," I said honestly. "But we'll be okay. We have each other, and Andy, and tomorrow we can pack up and leave if we need to." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. When it was time for bed, I set up the GoPro inside our tent, positioning it to record the entrance and as much of the interior as possible. Sarah watched me silently, her face tense. "I'll stay awake as long as I can," I promised as we climbed into our sleeping bags. "Try to get some sleep." Sarah reached for my hand in the darkness. "I don't think I can." Andy, instead of settling at our feet as usual, sat alert at the tent entrance, his ears perked and his body rigid. Occasionally, he would growl softly at sounds neither Sarah nor I could hear. I checked my watch. 10:37 p.m. Hours to go before the time when the clicking usually started. I held my knife in Sarah's hand as we waited for whatever the night would bring. I stared at the roof of our tent, my watch showing 1:47 a.m. For hours, I'd been lying there, switching between nervous alertness and brief moments of almost sleep that never fully took over. Sarah had eventually fallen into a restless doze beside me, her breathing shallow and sometimes interrupted by twitches. My body needed sleep badly, but the memory of last night's clicking sounds kept me wide awake. Andy hadn't moved from his watchful spot at the foot of our sleeping bags. Every so often, his ears would perk up at some sound outside, his body going stiff before settling back to waiting. The forest outside our tent was filled with normal night sounds, wind moving through pine needles, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant scurrying of small night animals. These natural sounds had become comforting rather than scary. As long as they continued, whatever made those clicking noises wasn't nearby. I checked my watch again. 1:58 a.m. The boring glow of the digital numbers seemed to mock how tired I was. 2 nights with barely any sleep was wearing me down. My eyes burned and I kept blinking hard to keep them open. Then everything changed. The forest went quiet. One moment, the natural mix of night sounds surrounded us. The next, complete silence. Andy's head snapped up, his body freezing. At exactly 2 a.m., the clicking began. Click, click, click. The sound was so close that I immediately sat upright. Unlike previous nights when the clicking had started far away, these sounds came from right outside our tent walls. So near that I thought if I pressed my hand against the thin nylon, I might touch whatever was making them. Sarah stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. "Mike," she mumbled, still half asleep. "Shh," I whispered, putting a hand on her arm. Click, 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 click. Sarah sat up quickly, now fully awake. "What is that?" she asked very quietly. I put a finger to my lips, then pointed to the tent wall just inches from us. The clicking continued, moving slowly around our tent. Andy had begun a low, continuous growl, his fur standing up as he showed his teeth toward the sounds. Sarah grabbed my arm, squeezing hard. "What makes a sound like that?" she whispered. I shook my head, not wanting to speak. The clicking patterns had changed from previous nights. They were more complex now, with different rhythms and tones. Sometimes quick clusters of clicks, sometimes slower, more careful patterns with pauses between. It reminded me of Morse code or some other form of communication. Click, click, pause. Click, 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 pause. Click. The pattern repeated, then changed slightly, as if asking a question and waiting for a response. Sarah pressed herself against me, shaking. "There's more than one," she whispered. She was right. I could hear the clicking coming from several directions at once. Not echoes, but different things surrounding our tent. I figured there were at least 3 separate creatures circling us, maybe more. Andy's growl grew louder, and I reached out to place a hand on his back, feeling how tense his muscles were. I was afraid his growling might make whatever was out there angry, but I couldn't bring myself to quiet him. His warning was the only defense we had. The camera, I mouthed to Sarah, pointing to the GoPro I'd set up earlier. She nodded, understanding. The camera was recording everything, both the sounds and whatever might be visible through the tent's mesh windows. It was our only hope of understanding what we were dealing with. For over 4 hours we sat frozen in place, barely breathing as the clicking continued its maddening patterns around our tent. Sometimes the sounds would stop completely for several minutes, making us incredibly tense. Then they would resume suddenly, often from a completely different position than before. Sarah kept a death grip on my arm the entire time, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The shared terror was communication enough. Around 4:30 a.m., the clicking patterns changed again, becoming more frantic and overlapping. It sounded almost like an argument or a heated discussion among the entities outside. Andy's growling got stronger in response, getting ready to attack if needed. I held the knife tightly, preparing for the worst, for the tent fabric to tear open, for something to reach inside. My muscles ached from being held tense for so long, but adrenaline kept me alert, even though I was exhausted. Sarah had her phone clutched in her other hand, thumb poised over the emergency call button. We both knew it was pointless. We were miles from the nearest road, and help would take hours to reach us. But the gesture gave her some small comfort. The clicking continued unabated until the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. As the darkness began to recede, the sounds gradually moved farther away from our tent, as if retreating from the coming light. By 5:45 a.m., as the forest began to fill with early morning bird song, the clicking stopped completely. Neither of us moved for a long time, not quite believing it was over. Andy finally relaxed his stance, slumping down with an exhausted sigh. Sarah released her grip on my arm, leaving deep red marks where her fingers had dug into my skin. "They're gone," I whispered, my voice hoarse from hours of silence. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "What were they?" she asked, the question barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we've got it on camera." With shaking hands, I reached for the GoPro. My fingers felt clumsy from exhaustion and fear as I disconnected it from its power bank and turned it toward us. Sarah wiped her tears away, leaning in close as I navigated to the video playback function. I scrolled through the footage, starting from when we'd gone to bed. Hours of nothing but us, lying in our sleeping bags, occasionally changing positions. I fast-forwarded through it until I reached the 2 a.m. mark when the clicking had begun. The audio picked up the sounds clearly, those hollow, empty clicks that had surrounded us all night. I continued skimming through the footage, watching the timestamp in the corner. "Stop," Sarah said suddenly, pointing at the screen. "Go back, I saw something." I rewound the footage to around 3:40 a.m., then played it at normal speed. For a minute, nothing happened beyond the clicking sounds and occasional glimpses of Andy sitting alert at the bottom of the frame. Then, at exactly 3:42 a.m., something appeared in the frame. A face. I froze in fear. The image was blurry but clearly visible. A long white face pressed against the mesh window of our tent, just inches from the camera lens. It had something sticking out where a nose and mouth should be, kind of like a beak. But its eyes, God, its eyes, made me feel sick. They were bulging and completely white, reflecting the camera's infrared light so they shined in the darkness. The creature seemed to be watching us as we slept, with its head tilted weirdly. It stayed completely still for nearly 30 seconds before slowly backing away from the window and disappearing. Sarah screamed, dropping the camera and moving backward until she hit the far wall of the tent. "What the fuck was that?" she yelled, sounding terrified. I couldn't answer. I was too scared to speak. I picked up the camera and rewound the footage again, making myself look more closely at the thing that had been watching us. Its skin was white and had a weird texture, kind of like feathers, but not exactly. The beak thing wasn't really a bird's beak. It looked more like the mouth and nose had been pulled forward. And those eyes. They didn't blink once the whole time it watched us. "We need to leave," Sarah said, already grabbing her backpack. "Now. Right now." I nodded, unable to find words. The creature on the camera had confirmed every fear I'd been hiding since the first night we heard those clicking sounds. Something unnatural was in these woods, something that had been watching us, studying us, circling our camp each night. Sarah moved with frantic energy, rolling up our sleeping bags and stuffing them into their compression sacks without bothering to fold them properly. I began gathering our clothes and personal items, shoving them messily into my backpack. "Andy needs to go out," I said, suddenly remembering our dog hadn't been outside since before bed. He was standing by the tent door, looking uncomfortable. "Can it wait until we're packed?" Sarah asked, her hands shaking as she tried to collapse our small camping lantern. "I don't think so," I replied, looking at Andy's anxious posture. "I'll take him out quickly while you finish packing the sleeping gear." Sarah nodded, though I could tell she didn't like the idea of us separating, even briefly. "Be careful," she said, sounding scared. I unzipped the tent door, knife still in hand, and stepped out with Andy. The early morning light showed our campsite looking normal, peaceful even. Birds were singing and a light mist covered the ground. Andy immediately went to the edge of our campsite to pee, but instead of finishing quickly like he usually did, he suddenly stopped. His whole body went stiff, head raised, staring hard toward the trees on the far side of our clearing. I looked where he was looking, trying to see through the morning mist. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the dark pine trees fading into the distance. Then I caught a flash of movement about 50 yards away, something pale moving between distant trees. It was there for just a second, then gone, moving in a way that terrified me. I grabbed Andy's collar and pulled him back to the tent. "We need to leave right now," I told Sarah as I zipped the tent closed behind us. "There's something out there. I saw it moving in the trees." Sarah turned pale, but she nodded, now fully believing everything I'd been saying. "I'm almost done," she said, stuffing the last of our personal items into her backpack. We worked in silent panic, grabbing only what we needed and leaving behind anything we could live without. Our camp stove, extra food, and even our camp chairs were left behind as we stuffed our backpacks with only the most necessary items. I grabbed our tent poles with shaking hands and yanked them apart, not caring if I damaged them in the process. The tent collapsed around us as we worked. Sarah was shoving water bottles and energy bars into her backpack, her movements jerky and desperate. "Leave the stove," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of fearful silence. "And the chairs. Just grab what we need to get out of here." Sarah nodded without argument, sweat on her forehead even in the cool morning. Neither of us had slept properly in 2 days. She looked exhausted. I probably looked just as bad or worse. Andy walked back and forth at the edge of our camp, watching the trees where I'd seen that weird white thing moving a minute ago. He kept looking back at us like he was begging us to hurry up. I stuffed our sleeping bags into their compression sacks. The GoPro went into an outside pocket of my backpack. I needed to keep that scary footage as proof, but who would even believe us? "Mike," Sarah whispered, freezing in place. "Listen." I stopped, holding my breath. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just birds and the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Then it came, unmistakable even in daylight. Click, click, click. "No," I breathed, dropping the tent stuff sack I was holding. "Not now." The clicking sounds we'd only heard at night were back, but this time in broad daylight. This broke whatever rules these things had been following, and that terrified me more than anything else so far. If they were no longer confined to darkness. Andy erupted into frantic barking, lunging toward the forest edge with his teeth bared. Sarah screamed and scrambled backward, nearly tripping over our half-packed supplies. "Get behind me," I said, pulling the knife from my pocket and stepping forward. The clicking got louder, coming from a spot in the trees right across from us. Andy's barks got more aggressive as he stood ready to attack whatever came out. Then the trees opened up, and a man walked into our clearing. He had on a park ranger uniform with a wide hat that hid most of his face. He looked middle-aged and about average height, with a nameplate that said Wilson on his pocket. At first glance, everything about him seemed normal. "Good morning, folks," he called, raising a hand in greeting. "Everything okay over here? Heard some commotion?" I stared at him, my knife still at my side. Something was wrong. Very wrong. It took me a moment to figure out what I was seeing, but then it hit me. His lips didn't match his words. The way his mouth moved was slightly delayed, as if I was watching a poorly dubbed foreign film. "We're fine," I called back, my voice tight. "Just packing up to leave." The ranger stepped closer, and I noticed more details that made me freeze. He walked with perfectly even steps, too measured and consistent for natural human movement. When he turned his head to look around our campsite, the motion was too smooth, lacking the small jerks and pauses of normal head movement. "I'm Ranger Wilson from the Allegheny National Forest Service," he said, his voice pleasantly neutral, but with an odd flanging quality, like two slightly out-of-sync versions of the same voice. "I'm patrolling for illegal campers and checking on hikers. We've had some bear sightings in the area recently, safety concerns." As he came closer, I saw his eyes. They were too wide, too white, exactly like the eyes I'd seen on the camera footage. Human in appearance, but somehow deeply wrong. They didn't blink, not once. Andy wouldn't stop barking, his body shaking with aggression. He pulled against my grip on his collar, trying to get between us and the approaching ranger. "Our dog doesn't usually react this way," Sarah said nervously, a forced smile on her face. "He's normally very friendly." The ranger smiled back, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Dogs can sense bears in the area before humans can. That might be what's bothering him. Another detail hit me. His uniform was too clean. No dirt, no sweat stains, not even a wrinkle. No real ranger working these woods would look that tidy. "May I see your camping permit?" he asked, stopping about 10 feet from us. "All overnight stays require proper registration." Sarah started reaching for her backpack where our permit was stored. "Of course I have it right." "Actually," I interrupted, "we're just about to head out. We've been here 2 nights already." "Still need to verify your permit," the ranger insisted, taking another step toward us. "Would be easier if you came back to my station. It's not far from here." Sarah nodded, setting her backpack down. "Oh, sure, if that's..." I grabbed her arm, pulling her close to me. "Something's wrong," I whispered, my lips barely moving. "Look at his eyes. Look how his mouth moves when he talks." She stared at the ranger for a long time, and I saw the shock on her face when she realized what was happening. She took a step backward, pressing against me. The ranger, or whatever it was, tilted his head as he watched us whisper. The movement was weird, the angle impossible for human anatomy. His head turned nearly 90 degrees like an owl watching its next meal. "Is there a problem?" he asked. And this time, the disconnect between his voice and mouth movements was even more pronounced. His lips moved several seconds after the words were already hanging in the air between us. "No problem," I said, slowly moving toward our packs. We just need to finish packing before we go anywhere." The thing wearing the ranger's appearance stared at us, its head still tilted at that impossible angle. Then something changed in its expression, a flattening, a loss of the human effect it had been attempting to maintain. "You must come with me," it said, but the words deteriorated midway through the sentence, ending in a series of clicks that slowly formed back into English. "Station. Safe there." Sarah screamed then, the sound tearing from her throat. The ranger thing's face twitched, features rippling as if something underneath was struggling to maintain the human facade. "Car keys," I hissed at Sarah, never taking my eyes off the creature. "Get the car keys from my pack. Now." She dug through the side pocket of my backpack, finally pulling out the keys with shaking hands. The ranger thing took another step toward us, movements suddenly jerky and disjointed. "Stay," it said, its voice now a strange mix of human speech and hollow clicks. "Must examine, must study." "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Andy's leash in one hand and Sarah's arm in the other. "Now!" We ran. I grabbed my backpack with the GoPro as we ran away, leaving everything else behind. We crashed through the bushes, abandoning the trail in favor of the most direct route back to the parking area. Behind us, I heard something moving through the forest with unnatural speed, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but no heavy footfalls like a human would make. "Don't look back," I gasped to Sarah as we ran. "Just keep going." Andy pulled ahead on his leash, leading us through the woods as if he knew exactly where to go. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber after 2 nights without sleep, but terror kept me moving forward. Sarah raced beside me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds behind us grew closer. Whatever was chasing us moved faster than any human could, especially through thick forest. Click, click, click sounds broke up the chase, getting louder with each passing second. After what felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes of running, the trees began to thin. The parking area came into view ahead, our car sitting alone where we'd left it 3 days ago. "Almost there," I panted, pushing my exhausted body to its limit. Just as we broke from the tree line into the parking lot, something crashed through the brush behind us. I couldn't help it. I glanced back. The ranger uniform was splitting at the seams, pale flesh with an odd feather-like texture pushing through the rips. The thing's face was half human, half something else, the skin pulling back to show a beak-like structure underneath. Those white eyes stared at us like a predator as it chased us, moving with a jerky, bird-like walk. Sarah fumbled with the keys at the car door, her hands shaking too badly to hit the unlock button. I grabbed them from her and pressed the button, hearing the locks click open. I yanked the back door open first, practically throwing Andy inside, then rushed to the driver's side as Sarah climbed into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life as I turned the key. Through the windshield, I saw the creature come out of the trees, now barely looking like the ranger it had pretended to be. It moved toward us way too fast. I slammed the car into reverse, then drive, tires spinning on the dirt parking lot as we sped up. The wheels caught grip, and we shot forward toward the access road that would take us out of the forest. As we sped away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Standing in the middle of the dirt road was a pale, bird-like creature. Its body was humanoid but wrong, too thin, joints bent at weird angles. The head was long with that beak-like bump where a human mouth and nose would be, and those horrible white eyes stared after us without blinking. It didn't chase us as we drove away. It just watched, head tilted at that impossible angle, getting smaller in my mirror until we rounded a bend in the road and it disappeared from view. Sarah was sobbing beside me, her whole body shaking. In the back seat, Andy whined and pressed himself against the door, as far from the forest side of the car as he could get. "Did you see it?" she asked between sobs. "Did you see what it really was?" "I saw it," I confirmed, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. We didn't speak again until we reached the main highway, putting miles between ourselves and Allegheny National Forest. The morning sun felt like a blessing on my skin through the car window, grounding me in a reality where creatures with clicking voices didn't exist. "Never again," Sarah finally said, her voice raw from crying. "I'm never going camping again." "Never," I agreed, pressing the accelerator harder as we headed home. "Not in a million years."